Welcome to the show, Abud. I'm excited to have you on. I'm a big fan. I've been reading your interventions and listening to your episodes. I love the episodes you did with Jay from Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. They were really informative. They kept me company on several long drives, actually. So I feel like I have a weird parasocial relationship. I was like thinking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, this is like what other people do with my show. I keep them company on their long drives. So thank you for taking those rides with me. How are you doing? How's the vibe there? You're in the West Bank, obviously. What's going on?
It's At this point, it's first of all, thank you for having me, Sina. I'm really happy to be a friend through my voice in your car as well. The vibes in the West Bank, it's a bit depressive. A bit, there's a lot of frustration now around the fact that the war has not ended sooner. Most people perhaps thought that it would be finished, early this year, but it still continues on, and with it, the destruction and the dehumanization, and everything that you guys and the people listening or viewing this will, recognize as this utter and complete lack of respect for Palestinian lives throughout this war. So there's that feeling of, in the West Bank that we could be next in terms of how Israel could go on with this war. But at the same time, a feeling that as this war continues, and as Ramadan is approaching, and as operations from the West Bank targeting, some of the Israeli soldiers on checkpoints, etc., are increasing, that also things might, erupt in a spontaneous fashion, because in the West Bank, there's less of an organized movement that can actually create this kind of revolutionary creative rupture. It's more of a spontaneous act. And Ramadan is generally a season for things to break through and roll. So yeah, I mean, it's a mixed emotion. You feel targeted, but not targeted yet, in the way that at least Gaza is, and at the same time, fear, hope are also coexisting at the same time. Yeah.
So I guess at the outset, I mean, we're watching this genocide 4 months in. This is one of the most violent military campaigns in human history. The equivalent of, I think by now, three nuclear bombs have been dropped in terms of like the destructive force on this like refugee enclave. So the West has completely shown its hypocrisy insofar as that it claims to uphold all these values. I mean, what's new? But it claims to hold all these values, and yet, in the face of like even by its own systems erected by itself, namely the ICJ, like the name genocide is out there and it's clear. And even the actors themselves, the Zionists, are proudly doing genocide. They're happy to do it. Like it's the one thing that unites their society, their disparate society, is their agreement on the necessity of genocidal and brutal force on their indigenous subjects, right? Arabs, as they love to call it, this kind of dehumanizing language. So, in the midst of all this, you're watching from the West Bank. I mean, I guess it opens the sort of the opening salvo of this conversation. I mean, in our prep, I wanted to talk about like where one of the sort of results of this, like like October 7th, and I think you brought this up in one of your episodes. October 7th is the product of a military buildup and a strategic buildup on the part of the Palestinian resistance. And as you make it clear, like you have to talk about resistances because it is a sort of diverse movement. Now, here we are after 4 months, and the people of Gaza have not been moved. They remain steadfast in where they are, suffering though they may be. The plan was to eradicate Gaza and then force the people out. That first part has worked out for the Zionists, which was the easy part. The hard part was getting them to go, which they're not doing. and on top of that, the resistance to them, the military resistance, has stiffened. If anything, it's grown, just insofar as like they're, even if the rockets aren't flying at the same pace, is that like the on the ground, like insurgent forces have established themselves, and the Zionist military cannot like make its achievement. So I guess I'm wondering at the outset, from your view as someone who grew up in the post Oslo era, how would you say that Oslo brought us to this point? That the signing of the Oslo agreements, and I guess this is like a question about how does history work? Because when you because essentially what I'm doing is like drawing a line between like the sort of famous handshake on the White House lawn to the image of the Palestinian resistance fighter on a paraglider sailing over like the Gaza envelope, right? Like, and I'm tempted to say that you can draw a line between those two moments because of what the attempt at Oslo was and its failure in to achieve that attempt, right? But do you think, I mean, I guess at the outset, is that a fair statement? Or is like, or is October 7th really just like an unfolding of a larger historical process that begins prior to the Nakba even, right? Like prior to like the 40s, prior to the 30s, right? Like a sort of project of resistance. Like, is it really fair to say that, or is both true?
Well, I think both are true, and I do look. I think whenever we speak about resistance, I don't think it's necessarily tied to a specific, agreement or historical conjuncture, particularly. But what also does it forces resistance to rethink itself and its mode of operation. No, it enables or it forces those among the Palestinians who are interested in confronting and defying this colonial system, who are attempting to deform this colonial, regime of forms, if you want, to think new political action and what it means. So also has a deep impact on how space was reconfigured, for instance, and how that spatial distance that separated Palestinians from Israelis, that used to be more intimate before Oslo, became the focal point for thinking action or political action in terms of, how do you reach and hit a target? So in a sense of ballistic, it forms or propels and increases and intensifies the process of militancy, unlike the first intifada, for instance, that preceded the Oslo agreements, where Palestinians were thinking collective action on a more civil disobedience, more non-cooperation tactics, etc. So Oslo, I mean, and this is not generally speaking how people approach the Oslo agreement. Like, if you actually open up any text on Oslo, even from a lot of Palestinian, intelligentsia and academics, they would, try to mark it as this, the moment of defeat. It's the Versailles, like Edward Said has, claimed. It's a moment of complete capitulation. To some degree, that's true on the part of, the PLO leadership at some level, and even then, it's not completely true. It's not completely true because what happens and what is not explained by most Palestinians and by most Palestinian scholars. How do you get Oslo and 6 years later or 7 years later, you have one of also the most intense violent confrontations of the Second Intifada? So it's made to be this moment that signifies capitulation, surrender, a hegemonic moment, the reordering of social classes in Palestinian society. And a lot of that is true on some level, but that is almost always exaggerated. It's almost always, built up more or hyped more than it should be. Despite the fact that when we look at the 1990s or we look at the beginning of the millennia, we see that actually resistances took different shapes, forms, and started to operate through a different medium, now under the aegis or under the influence of Islamist forces in Palestinian society, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, more so than the secular or perhaps PLO affiliated parties, whether it's PFLP, DFLP, or Fatah, And those people start building the organizational infrastructure on which the Gaza resistance now is able to both conduct an offensive attack on October 7th, and it's able to withstand almost 4 months of an Israeli onslaught that you described really well as one of the most violent that we have ever seen. In fact, resistance, because it has been built quite, subterranean infrastructure, invention or creation, adaptation of new weapons that suit the nature of the battlefield in the Gaza Strip, built on tactics that can hurt the Israeli, military machine. It's able to actually run a long-term struggle, a war of attrition, as is now happening in the Gaza Strip, which is actually propelling Israelis. And I'm not saying here to legitimize it on a moral level, but what it propels Israelis that are, who have two inflection points. The first is that they're not willing to really sacrifice a lot of their own soldiers to target the civilian population in Gaza, to render them hungry, to target their civil infrastructure, to destroy the city and kill it. These are the type of policies on which Israel's strategy, military strategy, is built. It's not to confront on the resistance itself, but to actually make the civilian population pay a price, and then therefore rendering the civilian population some sort of, more willing and amenable to any negotiations, any rearrangement of political power in the Gaza Strip, etc. So in many ways, I think, yes, Oslo does provide the ground on which a more militant movement organized, one that has exceeded also the notion of an intifada that was very predominant in Palestinian history. And I think this is one of the most fundamental aspects. It comes with its pitfalls, like, because an intifada is a form of collective decision making that is almost unconscious, an eruption that is called spontaneous, or is rendered spontaneous. Nobody's really takes responsibility. You can always go to any Palestinian conference, for instance, on the first intifada, and most people would be fighting who's responsible for the first intifada. Somebody from the DFLP will be fighting somebody from PFLP, fighting somebody from Hamas. There's that kind of wide disagreement that everybody's trying to take credit for that revolutionary rupture, despite the fact that it was more of an opening of a revolutionary rhythm that nobody can really truly own up to. Now, what's happening in Gaza, what happened on October 7th, is that now we have both a decision to open a revolutionary rhythm and rupture. It's taken by a decider that we can know, even a person or a specific group of people who are the leaders of Al-Qassam brigades in this case, and that opens this strategic event and weds it to a strategic actor. So, like, that's one of the things that have been missing, at least since the inception of the Israeli occupation in 1967, in Palestinian resistance within historic Palestine. And that's what happened on October 7th. And that buildup is happening since the late 80s up to this day. But for me personally, I would say that it's more the first intifada that propels this kind of revolutionary rhythm within Palestinian society. Also does reconfigure it, also does impact it. It forces it to become more militant. It changes the spatial arrangements, as I said before. But I think that for me, the great, opening, the great breakthrough comes in 1987 in the first intifada. And what we're seeing now is just one of the many historical lineages of the first intifada.
So yeah, there's a lot in what you said, and I think, and we talked about this off mic. I think at the outset, and this is something that I've been trying to sort of think through for a while. And I asked an episode I recently did with Max Isle about it, and it's kind of been in my brain. But I was thinking about the kind of evolution of Palestinian resistance and its ideological, let's say, propellant, in the sense that the I would say, is that, like, the image we have of the first intifada is a kind of secular movement, right? A kind of grassroots, um, secular struggle using the kind of civil disobedience tools that we here in the West really love to vaunt. Like we really love to we love protesting. We love to talk. We love to idolize protesters. People sort of doing disobedience, right? Like there's a reason why there's this kind of legacy around, let's say MLK, right, or Gandhi. Like notwithstanding any, like not comparing them at all as leaders, but and not to sort of pass any judgment upon the movements they were involved with, and they were two very radical things, different, but uh, but in the terms of like how they're framed as a good kind of politics, right? And I feel that obviously in the case of Palestinians, nothing Palestinians do is good here because we have this Zionist press, because we have this imperialist machine that constantly dehumanizes you. So forget that. But I'm talking about in the sense of like from our perspective as people who are in sympathy or in solidarity with Palestinians, we tend to look at something like the first Intifada as this, and to a lesser degree, but I don't know if this is true, maybe not. But the second Intifada too, which had a more violent tenor, right? Much more violent tenor, right? And obviously the sort of and I think partly it has to do with the actors themselves, but maybe could you say that we're in a moment where the Islamist factions of the Palestinian resistance are like numerically stronger, first of all, uh do have a stronger military presence and force, that even if the actual individual actors themselves aren't Islamists, like if you interviewed every single Hamas fighter, like what is the degree of Islam in them? Like I'm not really interested in that. Like that's not, like you can, it goes back and forth. I'm not gonna like go there and like it, but in terms of like the larger political framework around that resistance, it is Islamist. Like first of all, do you think that's fair to say that that Islamism is the primary propellant, like sort of ideological propellant of Palestinian resistance today, um, and or at least its military wing. Let's put it that way. Whereas the legacy of the PLO and the PA, right? Like this is like an openly secular sort of political movement, right? Like they don't have an allegiance to any specific mosque. They do have mosques under their control, obviously. Like they do have a religious wing, you can say, namely the PA and stuff. But at the end of the day, you could is it fair to say that the Islamism now is the main propellant, as I say? Is that like a fair thing?
I mean, I think it depends how we conceive the role of ideology, social ideologies, in propelling or not propelling resistance itself. Because I mean, as you were speaking, you're talking about Islamism or secularism as a form that propels resistance itself. I think for me, I wouldn't place it as such. I think generally, historically speaking, I think a lot of these social ideologies, like the Islamist space in Palestine or the secular space in Palestine, whenever they wanted to legitimate their presence and their organizational or their social ideologies within Palestinian society, resistance was their means to spread their own social ideology. It wasn't that their social ideology is what repelled resistance in the first place. And this is, in fact, true for Hamas itself, because Hamas ties to the larger Islamic Brotherhood, which had many, attempts at, armed struggle historically speaking, whether in the 30s or going up also in the 70s and 80s, but as an organized social and ideological group with charity organizations, with mosques, with sports clubs, with this different pedigrees of social and charity work and other forms. It remained conservative when it came to engaging in armed struggle or in resisting the Israel's occupation, which actually meant that Hamas itself was a form of break with that history in 1987. It's a form of break, and it enabled Hamas to go from a marginal social ideological group with presence through its institutions and institutional buildup to become a leading force in Palestinian nationalism. And today, yes, we can say that Islamism is the main driving force of resistance as such. However, That does not mean that it's the only force that is in existence, nor does it mean that resistance is monopolized by Islamist forces in the Palestinian society. What it does indicate is the failure of the PLO, historically speaking, as a diasporic movement once it came back to Palestine under the Oslo agreements to sustain a form of organizational buildup that enables it to compete with Islamists on the basis of resistance. And having failed to do so, they have turned through also a class alliance, what we called also before we started the episode, this Comprador class, that has taken the PLO hostage. People like Mahmoud Abbas and the heads of security in the Palestinian, in the West Bank specifically, to hijack the PLO and to gear it towards a form of collaboration and cooperation with Israel, based on political survival and economic gain and extraction of surplus within Palestinian society, its control of the economic space of the West Bank itself, and what it garners for its own, let's say, families and sons and daughters, etc., as it continues with this policy of collaboration. So you had this, if we want, historical betrayal of the PLO as an armed struggle, and it led the main historic force within, let's say, the secular space, if you want to call it as such, the PLO, to become highly weak, tied to the PA and its bureaucracy, incapable of mounting a challenge to Israel, and geared towards this policy of collaboration. So right now we have this stark contrast on some level where we have these Islamist organizations that control the Gaza Strip, that represent this kind of resistance current within Palestinian society, that have large support when it comes to resistance, even among secular Palestinians, and at the same time, a PLO that has pretenses of secularism, although that we can also challenge, because I think much of Fatah and the PA is also very traditional, conservative. As you said, they also use ideological or Islamist discourses in their own form of politics, trying to outcompete Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in terms of the use of religion in politics. So, I mean, even that, as many Palestinians would say, they would challenge whether actually, the current PA leadership is actually secular at all, or at least secular in some way, but also pretends to be more religious in attempt to protect itself against, any ethical and religious challenge coming from the Islamist forces in Palestinian society. So, yes, we can say that this is a phase in the Palestinian national struggle and Palestinian nationalism where Islamism or Islamist parties and political formations are the ones leading the struggle.
So then, I guess that opens up a sort of broader question. I mean, and we know by now we've all buried Oslo 50,000 times, but I just can't help but return to it, partly because, and I think you and I are more or less the same age, partly because of the intense, just intense ideological and propagandistic warfare that was waged by Oslo. Because those, I mean, we like, just to put it in context, Yasser Arafat and the PLO were like orphans, political orphans in 1992. Okay, like they were actual, like they had no home. They were getting kicked out left and right. I mean, they were more attacked by Arabs than they were by Israel at a certain point. Like more under attack, that is. Like to think of that dark period, like the early 90s, right? Think of where we were in like 92, okay? 92 even. Like the Palestinian Authority took the side of Iraq in their invasion of Kuwait, the illegal invasion. It was a disastrous decision that cost them dearly inside of like the Arab political milieu, like at the level of states, right? Because like that was a disastrous decision by Saddam Hussein. It was criminal. It was illegal. It was like that he was behaving like imperial. He was behaving like a like the way Americans and Zionists behave, just in deciding to invade. And the fact that the Palestinian Authority like endorsed this move right? It was a controversial decision at the time. I remember watching an interview with Edward Said about it, and I just think of like that was like a crazy historic low point, not just for the PLO but also for the Palestinian National Liberation Struggle, right? Because you had that, like, to think about it at that time, Israel's place in the world was much more secure. Its recognition was like it used Oslo to help secure recognition. Like recognition with Jordan was like 94, right? Normalization was like 94. I got it wrong in a recent episode. Someone corrected me. But like it used Oslo to be like, look, we're good now. Everything's good. Call us. You can play nice with us. And to this day, they have like what, 400 million dollars in commerce with Jordan alone, right? Um, Now, obviously, normalization didn't begin in the 90s, but it certainly accelerated in the 90s. And Oslo helped that along because they say, oh, even Palestinians themselves, even Yasser Arafat, that grand like face of the Fedai, the guy who in New York says, I come with my olive branch and my freedom fighter's gun in that famous speech, right? Even they're shaking hands with Israeli war criminals, saying, oh, it's time for peace, it's time for reconciliation. So like to think of how dark the Palestinian national liberation struggle was in 92, 93, right? To think of where, and then I actually never thought of it in these terms, but you're correct. Not even 6, 7 years later, you have like the fire of Jenin, like going off, right? So, like, obviously, Oslo didn't dent any will to resist on the part of the Palestinians. It didn't like nullify that spirit, that flame, right? Like, but it was a kind of moment. But I guess in that time, you grew up during this era, right? Like you were there, you were in the ground, your parents, your family, you saw it happen. You saw like the scenes of Palestinian security forces with retreating from confrontations, protecting Palestinians from the military, from the Israeli military, retreating and saying, well, this is not on us, we made a deal that it would work like this. Like you saw this stuff. So like I'm guessing for you, being growing up watching Oslo, what what did it feel like in the 90s?
Well, like I was a bit young in the '90s. Like as a, I was, it was still like in my childhood years. But I'll comment like three comments here. I think first of all, like there has been different revolutionary subjects historically when it comes to the Palestinian struggle, and pre 1948, most would say the fallahin or the peasants are the driving force behind anti-colonial resistance in Palestinian society. Because it's struggle over land and peasants live off the land. Therefore, there's that material basis for why the fallah is the most significant and important element that propelled revolutionary anti-colonial resistance. After 48, that same peasant that became a refugee becomes the figure, no? And this is where the PLO comes and rises. The PLO comes as an attempt to organize the Palestinians now dispersed along, six Arab states, attempt to create a revolutionary anti-colonial resistance movement within these, Arab countries, some which were highly entangled, and in cahoots with, imperial powers like England and France and the U.S. later on, and some which had also their own, let's say, anti um, imperial policy, a desire to seek more Arab sovereignty, people like Abdel Nasser, etc. And the PLO was born within that moment of organizing those peasants that became refugees and now are turning again towards revolutionary politics, educated. And then you have this whole history of the PLO in Lebanon and Jordan and Tunisia, etc. So, from your perspective, Sina, what you said in 1992, it is a moment where that diasporic revolutionary spirit is facing a huge, problem. No, the PLO is exiled in Tunisia. The armed struggle in Lebanon and Jordan failed. The PLO was kicked out of Lebanon in 1982 after the siege on Beirut by Israeli forces. and the civil war that erupted here, this leadership, Yasser Arafat and the people around him were looking for their own relevancy. And I think in any sense, that kind of movement of the spirit of resistance from the outside to the inside is one of the most central components of understanding why I was also emphasizing the first intifada as an important revolutionary breaking and rhythm. And that's why I don't think the 1992, at least when it comes to resistance rising from within historic Palestine, from within the West Bank and Gaza, was in a crisis. In fact, it led to a crisis in Israel's capacity to control and sustain its own, settler colonialism within the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they were now searching for ways to manage the population without holding the burden, to separate themselves from the population. And guess who is, far away from Palestine, still has some symbolic legitimacy across the Palestinian society for its attempt at revolutionary politics in the 1970s and 80s. The PLO that is now in Tunisia, exiled and dying slowly without any horizon or hope for its own politics, and it's being challenged by a new leadership rising from within the West Bank and Gaza, whether from its own fold, from the secular fold, or whether it is actually Islamist forces who from the outset were more focused on inside Palestine. And this is also a central component. Hamas, when it started operating from within historic Palestine. It was less about diasporic, Palestinian politics. And therefore, that was, that's the moment of, that's what propelled alongside, the fall of the Soviet Union and a lot of the reasons that other people, give for the PLO to search for this kind of asymmetric recognition where Israelis recognized, that the PLO is the representative of the Palestinian people, while the PLO recognized the right of Israel to exist, the hope and the promise of a two-state solution, interplaying with the hope among Palestinian society more broadly of some sort of resolution that maybe would not, be completely just in terms of restorative justice, but at least will enable Palestinians to not live within the domain of the other, the domain of their colonial masters. It will enable them to live some sort of dignified life, despite the fact that they wouldn't have, accomplished full liberation or complete liberation and the return of refugees, etc. So a lot of Palestinians were hopeful in the beginning of the 1990s. They were hopeful that, also will bring about some sort of a better life, a better manner of existence, the disappearance of Israel's occupation and its brutality. That these are things for us when we live under occupation that are urgent, and we're always looking for ways, to bring ourselves out of this kind of form of relation that exists with Israel. So it was at some level a hopeful moment. But, and however, and like a lot of people would point out, anybody that talks about Oslo, if you open any documentary and also in any interview, and also if people are speaking about Oslo, they will point out it was an interim agreement. It enabled the expansion of illegal settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It did not resolve any issue that is central to the Palestinians. It postponed, delayed. There was a lot of procrastination. And at the same time, because there was that revolutionary rhythm that is coming out of the first intifada and continues throughout the 1990s, led largely by these radical Islamist groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but also by others from within this resistance current, the fact that resistance continues even throughout the 1990s is central, even from within PLO forces itself. A lot of people jump through this history and then they forget to mention, for example, in 1996, we had a small mini intifada called the Nafaq, or the tunnel intifada. It was because Israel was now building tunnels underneath Al-Haram al-Sharif or Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that partially that form of clashes on the frontiers were also conducted by Palestinian security forces on the behest of Yasser Arafat at that particular moment. So in many ways, the PLO, when it returned, at least under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, there was that kind of attempt at navigating both resistance and cooperation at the same time, both negotiations and attempting to build leverage through resistance, both an attempt to monopolize, when resistance happen and does not happen, by trying to suppress forces, other forces that are challenging the PLO and the PA at that critical juncture as well. But at the same time, it was willing, to go with what the people desired, defiance, confrontation, opening the political horizon. Yasser Arafat was always at least astute in that he would not cooperate or negotiate despite, the pulse of the people themselves. Now, one of the problems historically with the PLO is that it was never really, or it never really took seriously, and this is something that we can agree with, at least Yazid Sayed, it never really took seriously military science and the idea of how you build a military formation in a way that enables you to struggle, to maintain your capacity to resist, to double the effects of your operations, to think tactically and strategically. And I think that's one of the things that actually also Hamas, Islamic Jihad, have learned from the PLO. They learned that big mistake. And that's why they're more invested and more serious, alongside their ability to, ally themselves with forces like Hezbollah and Iran, etc., and learn, from the experiences of their allies, but also teach, perhaps, by their own experiences, this kind of give and take that is happening across, resistance forces in the region, to build a more serious military organization, a more serious military formation and infrastructure, and to conduct operations on, or to rethink tactics, to incrementally change them, to invent and create new technologies, to adapt existing technologies. These are all things that have started also in that historic moment in which we call Oslo. And I think one of the reasons I I'm challenging a bit the hegemonic narrative, because I think that it's important, as we look at the Palestinian struggle in this kind of long durée, in this 100 years, there hasn't been really one day where there's no resistance in Palestine or a resistance action in Palestine. There's always resistance. There's always forces attempting to organize resistance. There's always means and ways by which resistance breaks a crack in the existing spatial order. Now, sometimes it takes a very well-developed organizational structure. Sometimes it's less so. And I think what is fundamental for us in terms of understanding that 1992 was a terrible year, or was a bad year, if we're looking at the PLO's experience. But it wasn't necessarily the most terrible year if we're looking at it from an overall point of view of Palestinian nationalism. Like, one of the problem, at least for us, was always the inability for the leadership to sustain their fidelity for political events that rupture and bring up a horizon for liberation, emancipation, etc. We Palestinians had a failure of leadership across time. There was a failure of leadership. Sometimes not because the leaders themselves are bad, because the conditions, the objective conditions might be, not amenable to the Palestinian struggle. But sometimes because their own leaders would think about their own survival rather than what the Palestinian national movement's priority is. And one of the good examples of that is the Oslo peace process, because Oslo was a way to accommodate a defeated PLO and to accommodate Israel's inability to control Palestinian society in the West Bank and Gaza after the first Intifada. So this was a marriage made in hell between these two forces. However, it did impact things on the ground here, because also when the PLO came back, it didn't come back, without its historic knowledge of military science, without its historic knowledge of revolutionary militancy. It came back with a lot of its cadres, a lot of its own leaders that have had a long history of engaging in military operations. Yes, they were not as serious as they could have been, Yes, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad benefited from learning from the PLO's experience and recreated their own organizations along lines that take more seriously the ability of building, hybrid forms of warfare and in more organized forms of militancy. But at least that also integrated a lot of that knowledge within Palestinian society in the West Bank and Gaza that largely speaking did not have that form of experience. And part of the reason why the first intifada was civil disobedience is because that's the conditions for it. It's not because people only chose it out of you know ideological bent or because it was secular or anything like that. It's important to note that Hamas and Islamic Jihad were engaging in civil disobedience. We're engaging in protests and throwing rocks and doing small forms of actions and graffiti and strikes, etc. But that was the conditions from which these tactics developed at that particular moment, because it was enough at least to challenge Israel's military hold at that point to simply attest and create sovereign decision outside of the military governor's power at that moment. So Israel would decide today, you need to open your stores. The Palestinian resistance movement and its leadership would say you'd strike. And it showed that Israel could not control, the West Bank and Gaza. So you had these forms of struggle that was capable. But once Israel withdrew in 1993, that became, unimportant. I mean, now if you have a strike in the West Bank, I mean, you're not necessarily impacting in any way, Israel's occupation, at least in a significant way or a significant effect. So, some tactics lose their potency and then needs to be replaced by new tactics, new techniques of resistance, new innovations in it. And I think from 1987 until 2023, there's this good line of how we can construct at least a history of how both, a more indigenous military formation was created, of course, influenced by regional developments, influenced by the Iranian revolution, and its products, but at the same time, creating an indigenous army within historic Palestine itself. Unfortunately, the Second Intifada, the resistance was defeated in the West Bank. Most people were killed or assassinated, while in Gaza, the resistance current actually, at least was able to clear the illegal Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip, and then also take over the Gaza Strip in terms of governance, and created, the space for what we're seeing today.
No, that was a great answer. Um, so yeah, I guess the sort of follow up to that I have is to think about, like, it's because it's this. I mean, we're talking about a century long movement, right? Like, it's been a century of Palestinian resistance, and to think to think over the course of a century of like a population of like millions of people, and it's not like an easy thing to do. It's hard to theorize, especially when you have so many of these supposedly, like important developments that get, like Oslo, that get an intense amount of attention in this part of the world, but the actual granular details of which, like, escape me, someone like me, right, who doesn't live under, Zionist expansionist policies like you do. So I guess I'm trying not to get into the situation where I'm like, okay, here are the following like deals and political achievements or whatever setbacks that the following political actors made in the name of sort of liberating Palestine. And like, I'm trying not to do that because the Palestinian National Liberation Movement is a fractured movement, right? And it's not like a that's not a judgment in any way. That's not like a like the unity is like liberating Palestine is the goal, but the fracturing of that into these multiple factions, and also the fact that, like, yeah, like a ton of Palestinian population lives outside of Palestine, right? Like, that makes it itself a more complicated task, because how do you unify this disparate population, right? That doesn't have the ability to move and like the way that Zionists, like, I mean, that's kind of what Zionists did, right? Like, they unified this disparate population, but of course, they had the freedom of movement on their side to help unify this disparate population into a solid political movement that then benefited from external support, like massive external support, and in the form of the West, right? And then like that could obviously like metastasize into this thing called the Israeli state, right? Whereas the Palestinians suffer under the direct opposite. They're hounded everywhere you go. You, God forbid, you set up a charity in the West that helps Palestinians so much that helps Palestinians in any way, you'll get thrown into jail for 60 years, as they did with the Holy Land Foundation, right? So like this is something that I think about a lot in terms of like the record in terms of like the evolution of Palestinian resistance, but also in this time frame of, let's say, like whatever Oslo was, if it was a capitulation, if it was something, if it was this kind of act of desperation, that like inside, like this was also a critical juncture in the history of warfare and insurgency and the role and certain kind of technologies, and also the reflection of the actors, the sort of not the state actors outside of Palestine who support the liberation struggle, namely Iran, namely Hezbollah, namely Syria, right? That this was that the evolution of those actors also has this kind of like there is this kind of like fluid relationship with the Palestinian resistance inside of that. So I guess I'm curious, is that at that time, like to think of, yeah, like the Palestinians who are like, is it fair to say that like the model of Palestinian resistance in the second intifada was also one of like the fedai, right? Like the fedai holding his gun, standing his ground, doing a kind of insurgent act, right? But it was limited to that single man and that single gun. I mean, you know that the way that like, you know, Palestinians in Gaza had one machine gun at a certain point that they shared between them, right? That like they had like one bomb maker that Israel like apprehended and blew up, right? Like Yahya Ayash, right? Like that, like those are technologies that are limited to those individuals. Whereas now you now have this force projection that can extend far beyond a single individual, right? Like you, like one individual can manufacture a katyusha, or I don't know how many, but let's say a handful, right? And you can do that with like, you know, like scavenged, you know, like materials. So like the famous thing during Saif al-Quds, that like Palestinian resistance managed to find like unexploded munitions from like a British warship that sunk, and they took that and they manufactured rockets. I mean, this is a new phase of resistance that we're in, that like we're watching. And this whatever you want to call it, if it's like the era of rocketry, if it's the era of missiles, I don't know. But like that has significantly terrified the Zionist leadership, because no longer, and this is what's unfolding since October 7th, you have to, the amount of force you have to apply to quell that kind of resistance is so much greater than, say, you know, like attacking the Church of the Nativity, right? Where there's like 50 dudes or 100 dudes hold up, right? For a few months. Like the amount of violence you need to do. I mean, even compared to like Saif al Quds, like the amount, like they took down like a like they took down a few full buildings during that, right? Which was terrifying enough. Like I can't remember the big towers, Palestine towers or something. I can't remember, but like those big famous towers in Gaza somewhere, they just like knocked them out. Now they're doing that on the entire scale of the West Bank. So like the the response to the Palestinian militancy is so far ratcheted up, which tells you that like it's not like they just do that by like because they like doing it. They're doing that because they see it. That's what they have to do. So I'm just thinking now, like, what does that, like, what this moment that we're in now, like, what would you say, like, the potency of Palestinian resistance is now compared to, say, the second Intifada or the first Intifada?
Well, I mean, I was, I mean, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, when we look at the two intifadas and the 1990s or what comes in between them, I do see them as a precursor of this moment, as you said, and I think also the PLO experience is one that, you know, Palestinian resistance and the current within Palestinian society that think resistance is our way to for salvation and liberation, have learned significantly from. And this is why I don't believe in this, narratives of total defeat. I always think that even in defeat, there is some sort of, meaning that could be construed, constructed, lessons learned. And from that, it just, takes a shape of a trace, and then we can still find them in how new formations of resistance, attempt to operate. And one of the most significant is, of course, this development of both a governance infrastructure and a resistance movement within the Gaza Strip, devoted in terms of recruitment of people, organizing them, using its engineering backbone, using subterranean potential of the Gaza Strip within the limitations of being under siege, and creating from a lot of times from nothing something, creating at some point the Palestinian resistance were sending burning kites and using the wind direction that goes from the west to the east to burn Israeli agricultural fields built on the villages of the sons of daughters of Gaza in what is called the Gaza envelope. So there's a lot of creativity and innovation at play, and it actually starts with Yahya Ayyash. And I think Yahya Ayyash and the figure of the engineer here is so central for the experience of Islamists. And I've said that a couple of times on some of the podcasts because it's not emphasized enough. The extent to which a lot of these, specifically Islamist forces, are invested in combining their ideological, social ideology, if you want, with their politics of resistance and defiance, with their also emphasis on science and technology, and the ways that they can appropriate material, create objects of insurgency. One of them in the early 1990s was the human bomb. Now it's rockets and sniping weapons like al-Ghul and various forms of rockets and various forms of accuracy and payload. And also, the entire underneath or the subterranean city in the Gaza Strip that is enabling the Palestinian resistance to continue to have the capacity to resist even after almost 5 months of October 7th. This is what is significant, is that remember, like when we talk about 1982 and the PLO in the Beirut siege, we're talking about a 90-day siege, or almost 80 days to 90 days, and then it ended up with the PLO leaving Lebanon. Now we're talking about 140 days almost, and still the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip is withstanding, of course, partially because the population of the Gaza Strip have not turned against the resistance. I mean, I do think probably in most cases, Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are now, desiring the end of the war. They want it to finish. They want to go back and start to rebuild. They want to not be killed, to not, be rendered hungry. But at least until this point, we haven't seen, the Palestinian population in Gaza standing against its own sons and daughters or demanding this full capitulation to the Israeli power, even after dropping almost three nuclear bombs on the Gaza Strip. And it tells you it speaks to the, resiliency of the Palestinian people. But at the same time, I think it's important to note, I mean, look, the whole idea of Palestinian national movement, its unity, and I think this is a significant issue, yeah? But I will say something a bit more controversial here. I would be amazed if people under settler colonialism are ever unified in any significant way. I don't think people who are, experimenting with different survival strategies, whether it's cooperation or resistance, whether it's attempting to, think about only yourself or individual salvation or immigration. When you live within, these desperate geographies, like, Palestinian citizens of Israel have a different, outlook on how, what's their role politically, perhaps, when it comes to Palestinian nationalism. Even some would say or some of elements within, Palestinian citizens of Israel would say that, it's better to live within Israel than to, like, have a unified Palestinian national movement. So we have colonialism separates people geographically. It separates people in terms of what it allows in. And if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you have some rights that are more than, somebody in the West Bank. Somebody in the West Bank has more rights than somebody in the Gaza Strip. And then you have the entire refugee population of the Palestinians dispersed across the world and also within the Arab world. So it would be it would be an impossible feat. It's almost a utopian dream to think of a unified Palestinian national movement, or a Palestinian unified front. I think that has always been the case, that it's difficult. It's always going to be the case that it's difficult. Every colonial struggle that I have looked at has also have found, different forces, different classes, different interests, people cooperating with colonialism, people resisting colonialism, and they also clash. I mean, I haven't really seen, or I don't think that, for me, that is the most central question for the Palestinian national movement at some level. I mean, I don't think that we were capable or are capable of building that form of unified front within that geographic separateness between Palestinian citizens of Israel, West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, and the diaspora, but also the different politics that exist. But what is dangerous and what we should note is that in the Palestinian context, we have something more like a Vichy like government, where, those who cooperate with colonialism pretend to be part of the national movement, pretend to be a nationalist configuration, pretend to hold still a nationalist dream. That is what's confusing. That's what confuses people, is that they come and see some representative of the Palestinian people in the form of the PA or the PLO, and who holds power within the PLO right now, and they get confused. I mean, these are people that hold the Palestinian flag, that have, they talk about being the representative of the Palestinian people, and their aspirations for self-determination, liberation, etc. But in fact, in the name of Palestine, they're betraying Palestine. So that's what's happening in reality. And that's what makes it a bit more confusing, is that we don't have, a southern Lebanese army, like was the case when Israel held the security zone under Litani, that, everybody will look at and say, this is perhaps more, this is a collaborative, military, militancy that is structured and supported and built by Israel, to sustain its presence in southern Lebanon. That's what confuses people. I don't think that Palestinians are divided when it comes to, the potential of resistance. I think that at some level the problem exists in our own confusion of who is part of the Palestinian national movement and who's not. And it does sound complicated, but I think, we should just clarify it in simple terms. And it's not the first time that somebody claims in the name of some nationalism or idea to still also betray it, and sustain their own political power through this form of betrayal.
So then that's kind of like the tenor of my next question, is that you have at this point, like, Palestinians don't lack for arms, especially in the West Bank, right? You have a massive security apparatus that was, um that in some ways, I mean, not in some ways, it was literally the creation of Oslo, right? Like the PSF, right? The Palestinian Security Forces, like, this is the police, the internal sort of the police of the West Bank or whatever. And, like, they don't lack for arms. They don't lack for material, right? They're not starving. They don't have to dig tunnels for themselves to survive. So in some ways, to think of the Palestinian, like, the position of, like, the Palestinian population as being sort of like this disarmed group, I think is wrong, right? Is that there is an active choice on the part of the Palestinian, like, let's say, political elite to continue the farce of Oslo in the face of the most reactionary, chauvinist, expansionist wave of Zionism we've seen ever, right? Like Ben Gvir is happily announcing the end of not letting they're not going to let people into Al Aqsa, right? For Ramadan. I mean, that itself is and that's a provocative act. They're hoping to provoke more violence because that's what Zionists do, and that's what like a certain kind of Zionist political a Zionist politician sort of engages in that kind of thing. Obviously, first and foremost for the benefits of their own base, because killing Palestinians is good for Zionist political elite. It shows them as strong, right? And like this is not just unique to Zionists. This is just like a settler colonial thing. But like on top of that is that like the acquiescence of a Palestinian military, acquiescence of a Palestinian police class, right, to this status quo, right? That like that's I mean to me, like yeah, like the word we used is comprador, but this is a comprador army, right? This isn't like this isn't like some political echelon. This isn't, like drooling, Mahmoud Abbas talking about how security cooperation is sacred, and the famous quote he has, right? Like this is active collaboration while Zionists expand their settlements and they flaunt it. So like to the outside actor, you could say that like why do they do this? Like why do they collaborate? What's the I mean like the obvious answer is well they're paid to, right? Like they're convinced that it's easier to collaborate than it is to resist. And it's true. It is easier to collaborate. That's the point of collaboration. And I think that is it fair for me to sort of put these guys feet to the fire? I don't think so necessarily, but it's certainly correct for you to do it. So like I think that like at a certain point, like we should have a conversation about the active participation of Palestinians in their own colonization. And this has been true throughout the history of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. I mean, like a lot of Palestinian elites sold their land to early Zionists and helped them get rooted, right? I mean, this is not far fetched to say, is it? Or
Well, I mean, no, I mean, I don't think it's far fetched. I don't think that necessarily. We don't need to exaggerate it as well. But I'll try to be as nuanced as possible, and at the same time, bring out an analytical point of view around this. I think there is an elite here that is interested in sustaining his hold and extracting as much economic gain as possible. This elite is formed by a capitalist class, the security elites, some of the political class, some of the technocratic class that have allied themselves and were formed also through this Oslo process. Some of them are ex-leaders or current leaders within the PLO that have been convinced through their historic experience, and that's what permits this form of system to exist, that there's no way to confront Israel or to defy it in any significant means, that it's backed by the US, it's backed by the Western centers, that if I can't defeat them, should I just join them? That's the basic premise. If I can't defeat them, at some point it became more permissible to think of how you ally yourself and provide services for this imperial center, for the settler colonial state itself, that has its own contradictions to deal with, its own problems to deal with. And, this class chose this direction, chose the direction that we can play a role, we can manage the Palestinian population. We have this historic legitimacy that we can celebrate and place in front of the Palestinian people. We're the leaders of the PLO. We're the leaders of, the first bullet, as some in the Fatah party would say, that the Fatah party fired the first bullet on Israel in 1965. So we have this historic legitimacy. We're going to expend it through this form of collaboration. And it will benefit a specific class, but it will also be helped in, building a system, an economic, political, bureaucratic system that also ensures that most Palestinian population and society that are against this form of collaboration, that are against security cooperation, that are against are, that remain quiet, remain unorganized, remain incapable of mounting a challenge to the current, regime. I don't think, Sina, it's controversial to say that whenever you have a colonial powerful force, whether it's in Algeria or in Vietnam or in other places, whenever you had, forms of imperialism, colonialism coming and conquering a country, specifically with cases of settler colonialism, it's not controversial to say that we've seen in a lot of indigenous societies that, people, figure out various survival strategies. And one of these survival strategies is to become a collaborator, is to sometimes use this new power, this new neighbor like the Zionist movement, to solve your issue with your own, internal enemy. Lebanon is a good example of that. Of how religion mixed with capitalism, mixed with sectarianism, and then you have Israel, and some people would look, oh, Israel might be our ally, or no, Israel is the thing or the state that we need to defeat. That has always been the case. And I think from whenever Israel has risen within this region, a lot of Arabs, and not only Palestinians, and even maybe at some level or at some historical juncture, even, somebody like the Shah in Iran, saw this as a force that can be, you can ally yourself with, that will protect your interest, that can provide you with some military prowess against your own, internal rivals, or regional competitors, or whatever it is that you're scared of as a state. So I do think that whatever exists within Palestinian society itself, you can take and actually look from a larger point of view across the region itself, in terms of how alliances were formed in the mid 20th century, and how they sustained themselves despite all the shifts and transformations that existed since then. So, it's fair to say that in many instances, there are classes that are more amenable to sell their land, for instance, although it's not their land. When we talk about some of the Palestinian landowners that sold some of their land, and it was still insignificant in terms of the land ownership, a lot of actually the landowners that sold land to the Zionist movement also came from Syria, Lebanon, other families, big families. They have no relationship to the land. They don't work on the land. They don't survive from the land. They don't, eat and drink from the land. That's why Ghassan Kanafani wrote in the 1936 revolution, he emphasized the fallah, the peasant, as the somebody who, for them, the land is not just a commercial entity to build on. It's not something to be sold, and it's his own supermarket, if you want. It's his own way of of being and living and surviving and existing. And therefore, for him and for the peasant, in the idea of Zionism, even without thinking Palestinian identity, without thinking of Palestinian nationalism, the peasant is antagonistic towards the settler colonial movement. But yeah, we've had a lot of different forms of cooperation with Israel, whether it's on sectarian basis, whether it's a survival strategy, whether it's using the power of Israel against your internal rival or enemy. There are different forms of collaboration, and I think one of the issues that have been missing significantly in Palestine, what is called Palestine studies, if you want, is forms of collaboration. It's like we don't want to talk about the laundry, the dirty laundry that we have, and I think that is at some level understandable, but it's also on another level, it actually creates a lack in our ability to build a language and understand these different forms of phenomena and how they operate and what weakens them and how they change and take shape across time, also in Palestinian history. So if we want to say there's a century of settler colonialism, there has been a century of resistance. And there has been also a century of forms of collaboration. Before 1948, for instance, you had the peace brigades, run by the Niseba family, I think, or Nashashibi family, if I'm, I don't want to mix them. And then you had, things like village leagues in the 1980s that were, an attempt by Israel to set up, a form of traditional leadership, something that they're thinking of now in Gaza as well, in terms of how they could run Gaza once they destroy the capacity of Hamas to govern the Gaza Strip. And then we have this kind of historic, you know, quite confusing form of collaboration where once a liberation movement turns to a form of collaboration. Now, having said that, I do think it's important to separate between, the ideology and disposition of the comprador class itself and a lot of people who come from different, social classes, but still operate within, the PA or the PA security services. It's not to give anybody a blank check on what they're doing or not doing in terms of their own participation and their own, willingness to use, for example, violence against other Palestinians. But it's also important to differentiate between that because I think, in essence, you have a system that is set up to create among the Palestinians laborers who build Israel. For instance, once you take over the land and you deprive people from water and you deprive people from the ability to manufacture and you control their economy, you create Palestinians as, a huge excess population without their means to create their own economic well-being and with the need to find jobs in the Israeli market, which pays a better, wage than perhaps in the own local market, which cannot actually contain all the Palestinian labor force. So you have an excess population that needs to work. So you can also tragically say that Palestinians have built Israel. No, we have built every street, almost every house, every building. The Palestinian laborers have built the roads, the networks, the water infrastructure. I mean, that is also true. I mean, that is part of the tragedy of living under settler colonialism, that on the one hand, you're a laborer in a settlement, and the other hand, that settlement is built on your own land. These are the choices that people have to face. It doesn't mean people, once they do that, are collaborators in a sense of being, seen by the Palestinians as collaborators, and then they should be, boycotted or not talked to. But it does tell you about the tough choices of living under this form of colonialism that, controls the electromagnetic sphere, that controls land, water, any natural resource, that disables you from, building certain policies and incentivizes you to build other policies, that creates this huge bureaucracy that doesn't do anything, like the PA, almost doesn't do anything, and gives a lot of people jobs, and it's used as a counterinsurgent tactic. I mean, this is the reality we live in. I mean, it's a reality through which, if I go to a person who works in the PA and I say, you leave your job, the first thing they'll ask me is like, what should I do to eat? These are the choices that, are rendered within these kind of landscapes that we live in. And that is true also for Palestinians in Israel. And it's also true for Palestinians in Gaza. And it's also true for Palestinians to some level in the diaspora. Living for a century or so under this direct colonialism creates a lot of, if you want, difficult dilemmas and choices. Many of them can even be said to be not a choice at all. Again, this is not to justify anything, but I think that it's important to differentiate between levels and differences in who cooperates, what form of cooperation exists, and whether cooperation can be seen as betrayal or as a necessity. These are different elements in which we talk. And again, one of the problems we have is that we haven't built a language around collaboration, although it's as significant as, and as resistance. They coincide together whenever colonialism comes to any country or society, including in Palestinian society itself.
No, that was a really good answer. I appreciate what you're saying because it does sort of, it is a kind of sobering reminder of like the horrible choice that Palestinian, let's like any Palestinian person would have to face. Like, how do I eat? How do I go about my life? Like, and yet with that being said, like for all that we've said about the sort of about the status of the West Bank, like there is a cauldron of resistance, and that cauldron is increasingly heating up, right? Like it is, and it's interesting. So maybe, and it's something that like obviously the Palestinian channels I follow on Telegram and stuff, like they talk about it, but in our casual but with all the attention on Gaza, we forget that there are thousands of Palestinians who are actively part of, and maybe even tens of thousands. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the exact number is, but I imagine that obviously it is in the thousands, but who are armed, who do openly resist Zionist hegemony in the West Bank. And I can't help but think that, like, obviously, there is a famous quote from Khamenei, the Iranian sort of religious leader. He says, "We will arm the West Bank the way we armed Gaza." The degree to which that has successfully unfolded, I don't know. The degree to which Palestinians themselves have supplied their own arms, because you see the pictures of those guys, and it's no joke. Like they don't have it's not we're not talking about Jenin in 2000 where like they have like a Kalashnikov, right? Like we have heavy armaments that, I mean, yeah, it's nothing. They don't have the missile technology, say, that the Gazans have, but the force with which Palestinian resistance in the West Bank confronts Israeli settler colonialism is something that we should take stock of. I mean, the explosions. I mean, we're seeing the kind of explosions we see on like the attacks on military vehicles, for instance, right? And the way that those attacks are coordinated with, what are called the kind of resisting youth, and how they use kind of like, let's say, less sophisticated armaments to kind of bog down Zionist troops, and you see the interaction between those, right? So like throwing, like you inundate, a military jeep or like a vehicle with Molotov cocktails, and that forces them, the driver, to go faster and whatever, and that makes them drive into like a big roadside bomb, right? That like you see that, and then there are Palestinian resistance fighters there filming it and then posting it for a kind of psychological warfare. I don't think like we should discount, and I'm certainly not discounting this resistance, especially given that those people in the West Bank have to deal with not only the Shin Bet or like the Shabak or both, right? They also have to deal with the PSF, right? Like the own Palestinian security forces collaborating with, who know that if they don't help the Zionist forces police this stuff, their own lives are at stake, right? That the Zionists happily attack PSF forces who don't toe the line enough, right? Even those who do, right? Like there's all these documented cases of PSF guys getting attacked by Zionist troops because they just can, because Zionist troops are Zionist troops. They hate a Palestinian Authority guys just as much as they hate, resistance guys. They hate because they're Zionists. That's what Zionists are. So like, so it's I certainly don't want to discount the courage and the scale of the Palestinian resistance in the West Bank. Maybe, and I think you did this a little bit in one of the Jay's episodes you did, but maybe you can give us a kind of overview of what's happening, because there is the kind of triangle, right? The so-called triangle, like it's Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nablus, right? Is that the three? Yeah. Maybe you can kind of give us a sense of. I mean, I know you're not in either any of those towns, but like what makes it special? Like what is it was sort of what brought this about?
Well, I mean, the genesis, like anything else in Palestine, of any resistance is, of course, the first of all, the existence of a military occupation that is brutal and occupies and kills people, and provides for an effective need for revenge and retribution, but also to forge a form of political possibilities and opening that horizon up. However, I mean, on a social level, I think what this the genesis of this current moment in a semi-organized resistance movement in what you've described as the triangle, or like the northern of the West Bank, because it includes a lot of the villages and also a lot of the refugee camps and a lot of the old cities in these northern West Bank regions. Also lies in the rise of a new generation of Palestinians between the ages of 18 to 35. We have always seen that a new generation brings forth its own attempt at, breaking through the iron wall, Israel's iron wall. And, this new generation is also experimenting with that on some level. But also, it's a process indicative of the increasing weakness of the PA and the comprador class and its ideological hegemony over Palestinian society, because what enabled new groups to form and to declare resistance and to call for the return of defiance within the larger Palestinian society is the inability of this political class to control and subdue these areas without the need for security intervention. I mean, that is an important component of it. In one of my articles in the beginning of this movement, I call it a politics of unbinding. We see that a lot of these young kids are, sons of Fatah officials, people who were in the Palestinian security forces. Some are influenced or go towards the Islamic Jihad. Some remain Fatah but are not, under the aegis of Mahmoud Abbas and his own cohort, but still to raise the flag of Fatah. Some are from Hamas or other groups. Some are not really affiliated with anybody. And they're all kind of attempting to build an organizational formation around close friends and intimate groups, people who know each other in small towns, in refugee camps. But what permits this is this unbinding from this current political leadership, this comprador class, and its ability to control and manage, the Palestinian working class in areas like North and the West Bank. Now, there are reasons for that, including, the history of the refugee, the Jenin camp, for instance, fight against the Israelis in 2002, which is one that's still celebrated. The role of memory is important in the rise of this new movement. The role, again, of a new generation, the unbinding from the PA, but also the neglect, because the PA largely focused in terms of its, economic development and, the built up of its own city on places like Ramallah rather than the north and the West Bank. So what it did is it brought a lot of people from the north into Ramallah, creating kind of like an ideological vacancy where people who are affiliated with the PA, who are from the north, actually live between the north and Ramallah. Their lack of presence in the north also provides the impetus for having, a lot of people from within, more resistance groups and formations to find a more willing ear and listening ear in these areas. So there is that element as well. But I think also historically, the Northern and West Bank region specifically has always been a hotbed of resistance against colonialism. Even if you want going back to Al-Qassam or Izzuddin Al-Qassam himself in 1935, he was actually killed and martyred in an area called Ya'bad, which is just south of Jenin. It has a lot of forest in that area, and him and his group were found out by the British in that specific area, and then they engaged in a battle where it ended up him being martyred. So there's always been a strong force tied to resistance in the interior of the West Bank, and specifically in the northern of the West Bank. And it has always taken a specific shape that it's tied to these old cities, to the villages and the relationship to the city, this kind of embryonic relationship. And also after 1948, with the rise of this condensed urban spaces like refugee camp of Tulkarem Nur Shams or the refugee camp of Jenin, where you can have, formations of resistance operating. And because of the dense urban space, it denies the freedom of movement for Israeli troops to come in and arrest as they like, creating the conditions for the rise of this current moment and this new movement. So, I mean, these are all part of the picture of why we had that in the past couple of years. But I think the central component in it, beyond, whatever support these groups are getting from outside of Palestine, is this kind of dynamic of a new generation and the lack of the ability of the PA to control and manage its own population, indicating the increasing weakness of its ability to manage the Palestinians without the use of brute force. And we have already seen that multiple times in the past couple of years, including with the killing of somebody like Nizar Banat a couple of years ago when the PA came and executed Nizar Banat, a known political activist and opposition figure who who used to speak a lot against the PA for 10 years or so, but only in the past couple of years before his death, specifically the past 2 years before his killing, his brutal killing by the PA, did actually the wider Palestinian society start to listen and engage and feel like what he's saying, hits a specific and certain truth, showing, I think, generally that the mood in the past, since 2012, if you want, has slowly but steadily changed towards a politics that is calling for defiance, for the return of an ethical posture, for this tie with martyrdom and the notions of self-sacrifice, for getting rid of the corruption that exists in among the comprador class. These are all things that much of the Palestinian population in their day-to-day life speak about and complain about. And one of the material manifestations of how both these groups defy the PA and defy Israel is by exporting violence specifically against the military occupation, but at the same time challenging the PA internally.
So we're coming up to an hour and a half. I'll let you go soon. Do you? I mean, I always say this, but it's unfair to ask you to like look into the future. But we're heading into the month of Ramadan soon. Zionists always love to like make Ramadan like a flashpoint. Will Is there potential that it will backfire severely for them into a larger crisis? Because and is this what they want?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask in Israeli society and leadership, because I think, look, one of the problems that the people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have with something like the PA is twofold. The first is that their program is complete ethnic cleansing. Now, if you have the Palestinian cooperating with Israel, somebody like Mahmoud Abbas is an obstacle towards enabling the complete ethnic cleansing. So when Ben-Gvir and Smotrich look at Mahmoud Abbas and look at the PA, they see in them a dangerous normalization within Israeli society of the ability of forging some sort of cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis, even though Palestinians remain under occupation, under military regime and brutal regime, even though Israel maintains its expansion of illegal settlements and its hold of all the resources and arrests and kills at its likes. However, they look at the PA and they see it as an obstacle for the complete ethnic cleansing, for what they want, which is a decisive end of Palestinian presence, political or otherwise, on the in historic Palestine. So to do that, they need to get rid of even forms of cooperation, and that's why, at some level, these settler groups do want to instigate, a larger confrontation. They do want to create the conditions for it. They don't mind provoking Arabs and Palestinians and even the larger region through forms of provocation, including in the Aqsa Mosque, etc. They dream of building the temple on top of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and that is their programmatic plan. And now they hold significant power and influence over Israeli policy and direction. They always held, but now they're directly involved in policy making and influencing, Netanyahu, who wants to maintain a good relationship with his right flank, because his right flank is the only way he would survive politically what happened on October 7th, or attempt some sort of survival as the war moves on and goes on, and perhaps as negotiations reach some point of, perhaps a temporary ceasefire or a more permanent one. Now, is Ramadan a significant date? Yes, it is. Why? Because Ramadan has two qualities to it. It's it divides the day in a way that is different than the regular everyday life. Its tempo is different. So generally, why Ramadan has been, a flashpoint for confrontations in Jerusalem, and why did we have something like May 2021, Saif al-Quds, as you said, confrontation, which started in Jerusalem, is because after iftar, after people go and break their fast, you know, generally speaking, that is, an empty time. It's time for friends to gather. It's time for families to gather. It's time where people are not as busy as before. They have already organized their day on a collective basis, the entire society, that after 6 or 7 o'clock, they go out. There's the long nights in Ramadan. There's the, your ability to also move within space at night that generally the rest of the day in Palestinian society, for instance, or the rest of the year, I'm sorry, does not exist. These kind of like changes on a temporal level, alongside propagations from settlers, alongside the current Gaza war and what's happening, or preventing people from reaching Al-Aqsa Mosque in a critical religious, holiday, and even Palestinian citizens of Israel maybe perhaps won't be allowed to enter, and Palestinians from Jerusalem won't be able to enter. That creates a mix that could spell some sort of at least flare up in the next month or so. We've already seen signs of it happening in terms of the increasing operations by small groups of friends and people who know each other targeting Israeli the road network, or we had an operation 2 3 days ago. So you already see signs of both the frustration about what's happening in Gaza, the frustration about the process of dehumanization and mass killing, the feeling that this is perhaps going to be also the fate of Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and also Palestinians that live within or have citizenship in Israel. That could spell some sort of flare up in Ramadan, but it's always dangerous to predict a spontaneous moment, a spontaneous flare up or break up. But at least the conditions are there. Let's put it that way.
Abdaljawad, thank you so much for this great conversation. I've kept you for a long time. I appreciate your time. I appreciate these insights. It's a very subtle reading. I recommend everyone to go listen to your episodes on Millennials are Killing Capitalism, and also read your great interview with friend of the show Louis Allday in EBB. And I want to wish you safe travels. I know it's tough right now in the West Bank to go on. Are you basically just a prisoner of your house? Like,
Well,
can you
not the
move around
house.
easily?
We have like nice small ghettos, so every it's hard to travel from one city to another. Let's put it that way. It's not impossible, but it's hard. Checkpoints, a lot of daily humiliation around them, but it's our daily life. I don't know. We Unfortunately, we have normalized the abnormal, so at some level there's a normality to it. But yeah, most people, I think, stay within their own ghetto, and try to postpone and delay any more significant travel within the West Bank itself. Yeah.
Yeah, well, my apologies to keeping you so long. I appreciate your time, and stay safe out there.
Habibi, Habibi. Thanks.
Thank you, man.